Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Think Bunker. Today we'll be going over the evolution of the medium tank. Now, before we get into that, if you are a returning viewer, thank you for coming back. We are glad that you enjoy this kind of content, and we wish to provide you with even more or the same enjoyable content going forward. Now, if you're a new time viewer, welcome to the channel. This is the kind of content we like to do, but we also like to do other stuff if this kind of listen to us in the background sort of content really doesn't appeal to you. And we're also planning some newer types of content. This is also for our returning viewers. We're planning newer types of content when time allows. So subscribe, hit that notification bell, and it'll let you know of our future videos. So with that said, the evolution of the medium tank.
Interwar tanks.
So now you may be thinking, if you have a grasp of historical knowledge, why we're not starting with the First World War. I mean, a lot of these things start with the First World War. Um, why did my Now the reason why we're not starting with the First World War is because, simply put, the only real, you could say, medium tank design was the Renault FT-17, and it was really the most practical design of all First World War tanks. Now you could say the what about the British Mark series of tanks, the rhomboidus looking rolly thing, and the A7V, the metal shed on tracks. I wouldn't exactly call those practical as far as tank designs go, or as far as future tank design, the future tank design goes. The Renault FT-17 was the most practical of the designs. With that said, we have an entire video dedicated to it, which you should go watch. About 280 of you watched it. Thank you, by the way. But go watch that video if you want to get the lore of the Renault FT-17, because we did that was a completely original idea done by us here at the Think Bunker. No one else has done it ever. Don't look it up. So,
Correct.
with that in
This is
mind,
fact check true. Also, I would like to note, sorry to interrupt, but really the FT 17 and the Mark series tanks are the only ones that can be kind of considered medium tanks. But even then, the FT 17 weighs so little. You it's more akin to a light tank. The more a lot of the World War One tanks, like the A7V, the Fiat 3000, the um, trying to remember, like Char 2C, that one from that one plant that I'm forgetting because reasons. All of those tanks are just absurdly heavy. There's no other way around it. These are far from medium tanks, at least as far as comparing the weight of them to the amount of horsepower that's available in the tanks.
yeah, when I say medium tank, as far as the Renault FT-17, yeah, I really mean the vehicle as a chassis and its combat functionality in comparison to anything else. It's the closest you'll have to it. I wouldn't. I don't consider the FT a medium, but it's really the first comparable. It's relatively the first medium of the First World War. But with that said, we go to interwar period tanks. Now, one thing to note about interwar, as you'd expect, the First World War was very much fresh in everyone's mind. The However, these vehicles had to be designed in a way that could counter the First World War with like combined arms warfare and mobile warfare. These vehicles were designed to combat World War One, but also still function in that environment, if you will. So, I mean, you still have some big chunky boy designs, but you also have a lot of forward-thinking tank designs, such as the ones on screen now, that again move to counter the hindrances of the First World War, i.e., trenches and yada yada. Uh, Now, these were much more practical than anything we would have seen in the First World War. A lot down to metal works, but also mostly down to engine horsepower. Much like the aircraft, these things would become a lot more viable the more powerful engines and the better transmissions running gear available to these vehicles.
Not to mention the general increase in the quality of machining for vehicles of this size, and in combination with a more practical and versatile inner mechanical workings. So stuff like turrets are made ergonomic and sensible to rotate and use. Um, Housings for machine guns are shrunk in size.
Placement of the
So
crew, that's
you
another
don't
one.
need you don't need extra turrets for machine guns. You just need a little port and a 30-degree side to side for most adjustable machine guns.
Unless you're talking about the M2 who decided to forego that idea down there in the bottom left, who had four machine gun ports or turrets for its, or I would say pivoting turret mounts, pivoting
Yeah,
mounts,
yeah.
because
The
why not?
only like the I do apologize for all my um, starting and stopping. The coaxial machine guns were a take on the idea of we want a um a, a, a turreted machine gun, but only when we don't need to use the main gun itself, because you still might need a machine gun, but it's not mandatory, and you don't need to add like a auxiliary turret like on top of the roof of your already existing turret to try to lay down fire. Although some designs did that. I'm reminded of the one of the Italian casemates that had like a very small turret with two I think were 7.7 millimeter machine guns mounted in it.
Yeah, but that would make more sense for the for a casemate design than anything. More of a self defense machine gun kind of concept. Um, at least you're not the British who just put a turret on the front hull underneath the gun. That was a funny.
That was not a smart idea. Also, if you note on here, there are a couple of tanks that we've put up on here that are, in for most purposes, they're considered light tanks. However, during the early interwar period in the 1920s, when stuff like the Panzer I and T-26 was rolling around, they were effectively used as medium tanks. But by the time of most conflicts in the 30s, they were relatively light vehicles and would more or less fall into the category of a light support vehicle. Uh, um, but not really in any kind of like super fast cavalry warfare, because both of those tanks are not particularly fast. The T-26 especially, it's a fairly slow tank.
Though, much like Kento said, the reason why there are you would consider later on in the interwar period light tanks on here, it's they're kind of medium tanks when they were created. The T-26 was, for example, and the Igo Co in the middle left over there were certainly that they were mediums when they were developed, but basically regulated to light support roles later on when more advanced designs came about. So they're situationally at the time of their production and design intended for medium tank use, but were quickly outclassed and relegated to light tank roles. That's the whole
Hmm.
reason.
Although
That's
there were a considerable amount of medium tanks during the interwar period, the Panzer III was a big one. Um, the Brits were off in cruiser land and were not accepted into the church of the medium tank
yeah. I would.
because the cruiser tank is obviously superior.
Hmm. Uh, the let's have heavy tanks and only heavy and light tanks because the British are so forward thinking that they brought for a large part of the war the tactic of the tactics of armored tactics of the First World War. Great. Anyways,
No,
um,
they were not light tanks, they were cruiser tanks.
I'm
See,
gonna
they
I
sound cool.
shut. Um, but no, actually, on that point, we will have the reason why I didn't put vehicles such as the Panzer III and say the Chiha and stuff like that. They are interwar vehicles, is which you'll see in a moment. If you're done with this slide, I'm done here. If you want to go ahead and move us along, I will. You'll see shortly why I did that.
Like, try all the different buttons, and it's okay.
All right, this is where we get into the interwar tank designs that produced or designed in the interwar, but really saw massive amounts of service in the Second World War. The Panzer IV, the S-35, the T-34. Well, relative to a country's practical lifespan during the war, France and the Chiha, those were vehicles built in the interwar period but saw extensive service as a selected as one of or if the selected medium tank of each nation. Um, Mainly the T-34, the Chiha, and the Panzer IV up there. These vehicles were, um, as like Kento stated earlier, some of the other tanks such as the Panzer One, Panzer Two, they were you could say utilized as medium tanks during the interwar period, but fell off into lighter support roles during the Second World War. In fact, the Panzer Two served the entirety of the Second World War, but near the early part of the war, it was started being relegated to messenger roles, essentially running stuff back and forth and just basically stuff you know you're not going to send an actual medium tank to do. But these things
Well, I mean, it's like
practically useless on the front lines. So
some of the S-35s and like there were a handful of FT-17 or uh, Renault FTs that were technically used in the later stages of the conflict. They didn't do any frontline service, but these are the tanks that are produced right up at the beginning of right before the beginning of the conflict, and really see the conflict in the early war stages of World War II. Some of these tanks 100% survive until the end of the war and were intended to be used beyond that. For like the Chiha, for example, if Japan didn't surrender when it did, it was basically going to use the last of those in the defense of the invasion forces. Basically, meet the Americans at the beach and try to stop them at the beach. A lot of the M4A1s survived a large chunk of the conflict, although most of them were uh, moved on to secondary engineering equipment as the M4s Sherman started showing up
and then later the
into the battle.
M4A2s and M4A3s. or unless you were a Marine Corps M4A1. Those saw service shoot the entirety of the conflict because there was nothing, basically nothing to oppose them.
Um,
But
a lot of the Panzer fours, they would either get upgraded, or basically rolled back to the factory, upgraded, then brought back out, or they were used up until they were either destroyed or cannibalized for parts. Same story with the T30 early T34 models, except for the part where they get returned to the factory. That never happened, or if it did, it was extremely rare. They were usually just run until they broke or were destroyed and then cannibalized.
yeah,
It,
or
which is a kind of good thing about the tanks, that you can cannibalize them as easily as you can, because it doesn't clog up your logistical system trying to get these things back over into the factories when you need every train you've got, and trying to get these things to the front line. You don't need to clog up the trains getting back and then trying to unload them at the factories.
you essentially want to
It's
have your
just,
logistics being like a water valve. You open it and it flows one way.
yeah, which is a sensible thing. It was one of the few things the Russians, I'd say, definitely knocked out of the park with their medium tanks.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, just the idea of go until they don't go anymore and just replace them. Ideally, if they actually built them to spec, they would have lasted longer in conflict, which
Yeah, I was
would
about
have
to
made
say.
them.
I was about to say the only issue with the go until they don't go no more is like similar to how the I mean the M4 kind of operated like that. You only got rid of your M4 when a catastrophic when catastrophic damage happened to it. Say in the early war when your ammunition went off. Statistically, when the crew evacuated, except for the loader because he doesn't get a hatch. But statistically, when the crew evacuates and the ammunition goes off, it blows it out entirely. And then the salvage crews get there. It's like, dang, this is a complete write off. But those wheels, though, we could still use those. But the thing I was about to say with the T34, it's unlike the M4, as long as it doesn't get catastrophically destroyed, they a single T34 would last about as long as one that was catastrophically destroyed. If for an M4, if it wasn't catastrophically destroyed, it'd last for a while until replaced.
Mhm.
But just a straight up better thing. But that's all I have for the early war designs. Gento?
What I would also like to note here is there were a few conflicts that the interwar tanks saw. I was going to talk about the Spanish Civil War, where the Panzer I and the T-26 fought
Right.
each other, where they were basically engaging on tank conflict with each other with machine guns, basically, to mixed results on both sides. The Germans brought out basically armor-piercing bullets, and the Russians could punch through the Panzer ones. And it would be one of the few conflicts where nations would sort of get a grasp of what exactly do armor divisions need to look like. Because after World War One, the most of the countries in around the world are not involved in many wars, except for the Soviet Union, which is involved in a couple, and for Japan and China, where Japan goes into China or Manchuria with Hagos, Igokos, very few of them, comparatively to what you would see in World War II, as far as armor division numbers go, because the Japanese army suffered in terms of supplies and actually producing the amount of tanks that they needed.
The Navy kind of stole a lot of those.
Guys, we need to build a third Yamato.
Yeah. Oh, guys, we need to build another Yamato. The first one didn't work, but the second one's definitely gonna work. But actually, real quick, I'd like to also point out that you see here tank designs kind of lean more into the combined arms, a bit into the combined arms tactics. How war started to pick up its pace, and therefore everything else as a result starts moving faster.
Mm. If as your logistics is able to keep up, your army wants to go faster.
Mm-hmm.
They trade out a lot of the smaller early war cannons. The Americans really loved the interwar 37 millimeter.
I
Um,
mean, I mean,
there
okay,
were
I mean, it's a good gun. I mean, for a light tank, that is a good freaking gun.
it is a good gun, and um, the a couple of other nations used cannons of similar caliber. Um,
I know the Japanese
there were a
47
couple of
was a very
countries.
solid gun.
There were a couple of countries using basically modified 40 millimeter cannons. Um, Single shot. It wasn't like a Bofors auto cannon, but most countries are converging on the idea, except for Sweden, at least in the early war time period, that hey, we need anti-infantry cannons. We need high explosive, which was something that was debated, which was an idea that was tossed around. But most of the early war commanders sort of converged on the opinion that we need machine guns more than we need cannons.
Yeah,
Early war, everyone's sort of, whoa, cannons are actually a good idea. We need cannons.
yeah. The for reference, the U.S. did a test to determine whether what could kill enemy force infantry faster, a 75 millimeter high explosive round, or a host of machine guns. The machine guns did lackluster work, uh, whereas the high explosive shot could do many things all at once. Kind of going into that multi-role idea, it could kill enemy infantry because obviously one shot it's a big concussion blast, and two, it could also destroy fortifications and machine gun nests. Light fortification. Yeah, you're not taking down the Siegfried line with a 75 millimeter, but still. And also, no, the 75 millimeter M3 used on the M4 Sherman, the M3 cannon on the M4 Sherman, and by extension the M3 medium as well, was not designed as a HE launcher. It could also fire a very capable anti-tank round, the M72 armor-piercing capped round.
Mm-hmm. Well, the thing is, you need tanks to basically walk over enemy infantry, and you need it to take care of stuff like pillboxes
Right, exactly.
more efficiently than like an artillery bombardment.
It is essentially the idea of you got an infantry guy walk up to a tank. It's hey, we got a squad of infantry in that, or we got infantry in that house that's harassing us. Okay, what do you want us to do? Delete the house. Got it.
Mm-hmm. Um, and
Unless you're British.
most of the countries bring out a fair amount of high explosive um, during the early war when World War II is going, um, like the invasion of France. Um, with the exception that of the French, if I remember correctly,
Excluding
who were
the B
kind
one.
of well, no, I'm talking as far as our medium tanks, because
Yeah, no, I was referring to France as a whole and excluding the B1 design because it had that mortar in there, or mortar that short 75, but
yeah, the short 75, and
that could traverse a whopping 1.5 degrees. Not factual, probably it was more likely 3. It wasn't much.
mhm. it is not much. The I forgot to mention the French earlier, but the French and the Swedes, and to an extent the British, are still primarily using just standard shot out of their tanks, primarily relying on machine gun fire for anti-infantry work, but they did have high explosive. It just wasn't
Good.
used
Yeah.
as often or as effectively as a
Right.
larger caliber high explosive.
Right. But with that said, that's all I have for this slide. How about yourself?
That's all I got.
All right, move us along. And that does it for part one. In this part, we discussed the functionality and the overall design thinking behind each medium tank, or I say each, behind medium tanks as a whole by other nations. And then we go into the early war designs of the medium tanks during the Second World War. With that said, thank you for watching. Please, this is part one due to YouTube time constraints as usual. So please go watch part two. It'll be coming out tomorrow. So, with that said, get back to work.